Welcome, everyone. This week, we are going to look at human rights and social and economic justice. For those of you who are my students, make sure you're still tracking those service learning hours, and we're really going to be doing discussion boards every week to start to integrate the concepts that you are looking at in the book and make those connections that are so important. And as we move forward and we're talking about social justice, I'd also love for you to reflect on what resonated with you last week when you were looking at things like poverty and economic disparities. The problem that we have a lot of times is those can go hand in hand. For example, we're going to talk about discrimination this week. Well, if you are an individual, let's say you've gotten laid off and you are applying for a new job and you're being discriminated against based on your last name listed on the application, maybe it's a last name that's perceived as a certain ethnic group, you may not get a call back. So that discrimination now may impact you financially, which can affect you or keep you in poverty. And so when we're talking about human rights, when we're talking about social justice, we can't ignore the fact that poverty and discrimination and oppression and different things really can have a relationship together. Even though the word social justice, unfortunately, has become very polarized, it is important to acknowledge that as social workers, we're committed to it. In our Code of Ethics, it's one of our 6 core values. And so when you look at the Code of Ethics, here's what it has to say in that main kind of principles of our profession. It says that social workers pursue social change, particularly with and on behalf of vulnerable and oppressed individuals and groups of people. Social workers' social change efforts are focused primarily on issues of poverty, unemployment, discrimination, and other forms of social injustice. These activities seek to promote sensitivity to and knowledge about oppression and cultural and ethnic diversity. Social workers strive to ensure access to needed information, services, and resources, equality of opportunity, and meaningful participation in decision-making for all people. And I love the different elements in here. It talks about that we have to promote sensitivity to and knowledge about. Sometimes there are people that just choose to ignore or they don't agree with something, but sometimes people aren't always aware. If you're with a group of people that look like you, talk like you, and sound like you, it's easy to kind of assume that the world functions like you do. And so for any of you who have had friends or family members that maybe are of a different racial group or a different sexual orientation, what you find is their experience may be very different. But if you don't have an awareness, you don't have a sensitivity to it, you may not even be aware. And so one thing that is important is education, and not always assuming that people don't make change because they don't want to. Sometimes they're just not aware of the issue. There's Occam's razor and Hanlon's razor. And Hanlon's razors basically do not attribute malice to what is simply ignorance. And so I do think that sometimes making sure that we're educating and supporting family members and not kind of pushing and forcing a belief system, but really saying, hey, what do you know about this topic? What has your experience been? Can be very valuable as that nice starting point. We also need to make sure that we're helping provide services and resources and information. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, let's say that I'm a social worker and I'm working with individuals struggling with housing. And so while it is important to come up with ideas, housing lists, those kinds of things, if I have clients that are actively being discriminated against, or there's some like real shady landlord practices going on that are maybe against city or county rules, it's okay to also work with that client and say, how do you advocate for yourself? Do we need to call the housing coalition? Do we need to call the city? Like, what do we need to do to ensure that I'm not just giving you housing resources, but maybe I'm helping you, partnering with you so that you can advocate for yourself against some shady or illegal practices in the housing sector. So it's really important to understand that social justice is really, we do it at all levels of practice, micro and meso and macro, and it's something that we have to be aware of and part of educating our community about. So when we're talking about barriers to social justice, there's typically 3 phrases that we use, or 3 words. One is the idea of prejudice. And so a prejudice is more of an attitude-based term. It's how you judge or dislike a group, maybe based on myths or preconceptions, maybe different ways. You've had family members say, oh, that group, fill in the blank, or you've seen things in the news or the social media. And so you make a decision to dislike a group of individuals solely based on myths and perceptions that are maybe not accurate. And maybe you have feelings about it, but you don't necessarily act on it. So maybe internally you're going, ooh, I think that person must fill in the blank based on what my preconception is, but it doesn't necessarily change how I treat them or act towards them. But what we find with prejudice is, unfortunately, depending on people's level of prejudice and what they're prejudiced about, it can lead to discrimination. And what discrimination is it's an action based on prejudice that often occurs by treating someone differently or denying something. So I have a friend who uses this great example of, she had two friends who were awesome and they were successful, they got to school, they both made excellent money, but they were very tattooed and pierced. And so they were trying to find a house, they had excellent credit, they had the full down payment. But what would happen is they would apply, they would get approved, but when they went out to tour, the landlord would suddenly say, oh, no, we filled this spot. And this happened to them numerous times, and they started to wonder, were they the victims of discrimination, where someone looked at their external features or piercings and tattoos and made a values judgment about who they were and then denied them housing. So maybe there was a prejudice that that person had, people with tattoos and piercings, how they might act, and then they discriminated based on that prejudice. Discrimination can be in the workplace. They've also done research that found that individuals with certain ethnic group last names are more likely to have their resumes dismissed simply based on the perception of, we don't want someone from that racial group working here. And so it becomes really challenging sometimes to prove, but a lot of times when I've worked with students and clients who are from different groups, they will absolutely tell you stories of times they've been discriminated against or accused of stealing in a store, those kinds of things. And so discrimination is born out of this prejudice that someone has, where then we deny someone something solely based on this preconceived notion of who they are, what they're about, and what they might do. And then finally, we have oppression. And so that is, according to the textbook, a systematic and pervasive mistreatment of people based on their membership in a certain group. And so this is differential treatment that is really built into institutions and larger systems, as well as instances of violence. So we're seeing a lot of oppression in the news right now in different countries at war, and you have one group that wants to oppress another group. We also see a lot of oppression in kind of our larger systems, things like educational systems, where research does show that sometimes despite people's efforts, if you are a person from a certain ethnic group or cultural group, you may be less likely to get a mentor, or you may be less likely to have an excuse taken into consideration, right? And so what we find is oppression is, we think of it often as a dominant culture kind of oppressing a different culture. So we might think of countries, let's say in the Middle East or in different parts of the world, but oppression can also be this kind of systematic built-in mistreatment of people based on their membership that's larger than typically one individual who's being prejudiced and discriminating. This is when the whole system has this kind of built-in discrimination as part of it. And so it can limit people's choices and their access to things, and it can really limit their self-determination. If you keep getting told no, no, no based on who you are or how you look, then it's easy to start internalizing that and to feel like you can't make choices for yourself because you're going to be thwarted in that. Your textbook also talks about understanding the isms. And so there's a lot of different isms out there. Racism is making judgments or having bias or prejudice against something based on their membership in a specific group, say Black or Asian. There's sexism, which is saying that one gender or people who identify as one gender is better than the other. There's homophobia, which is making assumptions and having some disgust and kind of contempt for individuals who are of a gay or lesbian part of the LGBTQ community. There's also heterosexism, which is this idea that marriage between a man and a woman is the best way or the only way. And so one way we've seen heterosexism is really looking at policies related to like spousal benefits of gay couples in long-term relationships and making the assumption that if you're a man and a woman and you're married, then your spouse should be guaranteed certain benefits and rights. But if you're a gay couple or you're in a long-term relationship, that's really not what we're going to do. We don't think those people deserve those same benefits. We also have classism. And I tell people all the time, classism is one of those things that doesn't get enough attention. And yet there is a lot of classism. We make a lot of value-based judgments about individuals based on whether or not they live in a trailer park or how their clothing might look. We use a lot of phrases and words, things like redneck and white trash and, I look homeless today. So we have a lot of phrases that are built into our language and ideas that while you may have individuals who feel uncomfortable making homophobic statements or racist statements, they would have no problem making jokes about being some white trash or incest or any of these things. So we do see a lot of classism that people are not always super aware of. There's also ableism, so favoring individuals who do not have some sort of disability. So making decisions or policies for people who do not have use of a wheelchair or hearing issues, or believing that people who are able-bodied are the ones that should be getting jobs and people with disability just should not. They're not capable or able. We also have ageism. Anyone who has had a parent or themselves who has been laid off potentially in their 50s or 60s absolutely knows that ageism is very real, and there can be a perception that older people are not as competent or as capable, especially in industries like the tech industry, where there's really a lot of push for like young, knowledgeable individuals fresh out of school, and the idea that older people don't have that wisdom or can't learn. So we see a lot of ageism and discrimination in that area, especially in like workplaces. We also see some idea of religious persecution. And one thing that I've really noticed, we live in an area with a lot of variation among religions. And what I've found is that I've worked with some really wonderful people over the years that are so open and so inclusive when it comes to things like race or gender identity or sexual orientation or classism. But the moment you bring up a religion that they don't agree with, all bets are off, and they're negative and they make disparaging comments about a different group. And so we have to be really careful that we remember that inclusion and equity and all of these things includes supporting people of all backgrounds, and that includes religion as well. Even if you personally don't always understand it, we need to be careful that we're not bringing that prejudice, we're not bringing bias, and we're not using words that could hurt others. We've also seen a rise in anti-Semitism, which is the those of the Jewish background or faith. We've seen this idea of cis-normativity or cisgender privilege. The idea that individuals who identify with one gender or cisgender should have preference, or that's the only way, and so it discriminates and is biased and prejudiced against those who maybe identify as two-spirit or non-binary. And so again, making sure, thinking of policies. For example, I'm thinking about, an example that I can think of is I had a coworker who used to work in a psych hospital, and she said that when individuals came in, they changed the policies so that even if they had a different preferred name or gender, they told all of the staff that you had to refer to that person by the name and gender on their driver's license. It didn't matter if they wanted to be called something different. It didn't matter if it was a nickname or they were non-binary or had chosen a different name for themselves. You had to call them what was on their driver's license, with the idea that this is the only way to do it. And so it's that idea of cisgender privilege, that it's easy to say, oh, well, just call them by their given gender or call them by their given name, but that discriminates against individuals who maybe have selected a different name or identify as a different gender or a non-binary gender. And so we have to be careful as well with that. Finally, the idea of privilege is talked a little bit in your book as well. And so privilege is the idea that people who are part of a mainstream or dominant group have certain privileges that they benefit from, consciously or not. I read an interesting article one year, and they talked about the idea that, because sometimes people will say, hey, there's lots of people who are white but live in poverty. Where is their privilege? And I read an article that said, having privilege doesn't mean that you'll never experience adversity, but what it means is that your adversity is not necessarily based on the color of your skin or how you look. And so I know for me that if I'm struggling with poverty, when I'm applying for a job, because my last name is pretty generic, I don't have to worry about my resume having assumptions made because of my last name. So those are the kinds of things. And I know privilege is a difficult topic, and it's a complicated topic, and I would encourage you to read and research and really examine your own thoughts and beliefs. But these are kind of some of the ways that the textbook discusses the isms and talks about these major concepts. It's not in your textbook, but I really love talking about is the idea of intersectionality. And so this is a concept that has grown in favor. A lot of it was started or made popular by Kimberly Crenshaw, who really explained the idea of identity is more than just one thing. Identity could be part of one group, but all of us are made up of the identities and experiences, and so we're all going to be different. So identity is more than just a racial group or the gender that you are identifying with. It can be your experiences, your cultural background, religion, ability, whether or not you're part of the military or have family that was in the military, mental health, gender, economic status, things like your sexual orientation, your language, the neighborhood you grew up in or the neighborhood you live now, age, and class. And so the idea is that cultural identity is all made up of all these different overlapping social identities. And it's important to know that while intersectionality kind of refers to the identity made of all these overlapping things, what we also find is that people who experience multiple marginalized social identities are often at higher risk than those who don't. For example, one that I've seen is the idea that if you are female in some workplaces or settings, this can put you at a disadvantage. They just put out a study about a year ago where they found that actually race had less to do with your ability to get promotions at work Gender was the primary thing that determined if people were able to get promotions and how people were perceived at their jobs. So let's say you have an individual who identifies as a woman and they are already potentially a higher risk to be discriminated against depending on what job setting or area they're in. Well, if you then throw on the fact that maybe this is a individual who identifies as a woman but is also Black, they may experience even higher rates of discrimination versus someone who is female or someone who is Black. And then let's say you throw on maybe this individual identifies as part of the LGBTQ community. And so that intersection of all those marginalized identities could put them at even higher risk or higher rates of discrimination. And so it's really thinking about the different elements that make up our clients and the different cultural elements that make up ourselves and what that looks like. It's also important to note that when talking about intersectionality, one thing we note is that often we have to understand that when you're looking at these different groups, there's often as many differences between people in that group that there are between groups. So for example, if you look at the mental health, let's say that you have someone who's part of the mental health community. Well, there are huge differences between different mental health issues, when you were diagnosed, how they've affected your functioning, what the diagnosis is. And so you could have two individuals that say, well, I have mental health issues, who have radically different experiences of that. And so they may have as many differences between them as someone who has, let's say, bipolar disorder and someone who is in the military. And when you look at the military, there's going to be big differences between individuals who maybe are in the Marines or someone who's retired Army. And so the idea is that even when we're looking at specific groups who may be marginalized, we don't always want to make assumptions. We want to ask people what their perceptions and their experiences are and not make those assumptions. And we don't want to look at individuals in a group and say, well, 4 of you are from Mexico, so you're all going to have the same experience in America. The idea is that there's many differences between groups or among groups as there are between groups. And so that's another important thing to keep in mind. One quick activity that I love to do, and I've done this with professionals and I've done this with students, is I typically will ask you, pick a 1 or 2 word phrase that describes who you are. So it's only a word or a short phrase. Take a moment and think, I am, and write it down or think about it. Okay, so what I often ask is, was that enough? Do you feel like that I am, fill in the blank, did that really describe who you are, who you want to be, where you're from, and what elements make you you? And what I find is people always say, no, there's no way that that could describe all the different facets of who I am. So then we do a second activity. Let's say you pick 5 short words or phrases that describe who you are. Take a moment to do that. So maybe you found that this was a little bit easier of an exercise and it describes you a little bit better. But what I find is most students and most professionals I've worked with say that's still not enough. We come and we are this complex, beautiful mix of different experiences and labels and identities and cultural backgrounds. And so intersectionality shows that there's so many overlapping components to who we are. And I think as social workers, we have to understand our own bias, our own backgrounds, and work to then bring that cultural humility, that questioning to others to say, hey, I don't know your experience. Maybe we both identify as female, or maybe we both grew up in the same state, but my experiences are going to be different than yours. And I would love to learn about who you are and how that makes you you. So let's talk about social work's role as we wrap up. So one thing that we do is organizing individuals in oppressed or marginalized groups. That might be working to create a coalition to support a number of individuals. It might be looking at a group of people and realizing that all of them are experiencing discrimination in their housing from the same landlord. And how do we work together to make sure that doesn't happen? There's a movement. We have a lot of migrant workers who come to work in the agricultural area in our state. And lately there have been groups that have said, look, we need to gather individuals and empower them to advocate for themselves better work practices and making sure they're not being exploited. We also are thinking about things like legislative advocacy. What legislation can protect people's rights? There's a bunch of movements in our state, some positive, some not so positive, trying to protect people's rights. So we're really thinking in this larger scope of what are rules and policies and legislation that protect people's rights. We also can empower clients and say, hey, did you know that there's a grievance procedure at this organization that you believe is discriminating? Let's work together and let's see, are you able to call and file a grievance or a complaint? I'm supporting you. Let's talk about the experience. Here's the phone number. You can make that call. And then finally, I think bridging gaps between groups with common concerns. So if you are in a community and you've got a number of people that are concerned about adolescent mental health, and you've got a large number of people concerned about suicide in your community, you can absolutely bring those two groups together. I recently went to a training and they opened it to the whole community about domestic violence and trafficking. And it was so wonderful to be in this room with people who are, paramedics and first responders and counselors and social workers and psychologists and just concerned community members who weren't even in a helping profession, but everyone came together to really talk about human trafficking and domestic violence and what we can do. So as we move forward this week, I want you to think of these concepts. What bias do you have? What is your own background and how does it impact how you see the world? Then I would like you to read chapter 5, review the materials, and complete the quiz. You're also going to do a discussion board this week and keep tracking your service learning hours. Again, I would encourage you to do a lot of self-reflection and understand who you are, because when I understand who I am, I can help others understand who they are, and it just helps us see each other as rich, complicated beings and helps us understand better the ways that prejudice and discrimination, oppression and privilege work in our societies. And here are my references. Thanks. See you next week.